Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to BTC Radio Audiobook and ASMR. I'm thrilled to be your host today. Over the next few minutes, we'll embark on a journey through the airwaves, exploring diverse topics, sharing stories. So, sit back, relax, and let us be the soundtrack to your day. Stay tuned for an unforgettable experience right here. Tonight you are listening to Jews in Many Lands by Elkan Nathan Adler, Part 5. Part 5. Agricultural Colonies in Palestine. Rishon LeZion. I wap to leave Jerusalem on Thursday evening, the October 4th, in order to catch the Beirut boat, which was to start next day from Jaffa. Dr. Diaspora had kindly consented to accompany me, and show me over the Rishon LeZion colony. Our carriage was at the door by 8 o'clock, but, what with official business at the Serail and before the Qadi, telegrams to England and preparing for the European mail, farewell visits and endless leave-takings, it was only with much difficulty that, after about as hard a day's work as I have ever had, we managed to get away by midnight. Mr. Kamenetz, whose Hebrew hotel bill, both for excellence of vocabulary and calligraphy and for smallness of total, is one of my most prized Oriental curiosities, sat on the box by the driver, and off we drove in gallant style. This time we had a landau instead of a rude open wagon, and the road had been made smoother than it was when I first came, and yet the jolting and shaking seemed ever so much worse. I suppose it was because there was no view to distract my attention, and because I was so very sleepy and so unable to sleep. The doctor was an old stager, and no doubt considered the roads Elysian in comparison with those of Zanzibar, anyhow he did not grumble. We got an hour's sleep on a divan in Bonenberger's Inn at Ramla, had some coffee there, started again at 4, and after a couple of hours' drive, half of which was along a sandy cart track to the left of the Jaffa road, reached the colony shortly after daybreak. It lies on a slight eminence in the midst of a sandy plain, across which an unmistakable sea breeze blows. The total area is about 6 million square meters, rather more than 2 square miles. The soil is dreadfully sandy, and can support no cereals, though experts say it is thoroughly well adapted for the cultivation of the vine. This at any rate is the somewhat dearly bought experience of the colonists, who have in consequence latterly devoted their exclusive attention to the grape. The effect, from the aesthetic point of view, is anything but picturesque. The ground seems covered with low brambly vines, looking for all the world like the firs on some barren English heath. Of course, I saw it under comparatively unfavorable auspices. The vintage was over, and every grape had been religiously plucked from its parent bush. The viticulture is that of Northern Europe, and I must confess to disappointment at not being able to see each colonist sitting, or, preferably, working, under his vine, instead of stooping over it as he pruned. A vineyard looks infinitely more beautiful if it is trained along stately poplars or festooned from some other giants of the forest. But a collection of 1,000,000 low shrubs, which represent the grape treasures of Rishon, is more practical and remunerative, and certainly it teaches a lesson of independence. I am told that its black grapes in flavor and in size compare favorably with the choicest fruit of Burgundy, and that the prospects of a large export of red wine vintages to France are highly promising. Anyhow, no expense is being spared by the philanthropist who is developing Rishon. On the erection of a Kuvmir and cooling chamber alone an outlay of 100,000 francs has been sanctioned, and M. Alphonse Bloch, the amiable and wide-awake director of the colony, anticipates great results in about 2 years from now. The colonists take pride and delight in their work, each has a half-hectare or so of his very own, and all are idealists, and have a confident belief in the future. At the time of the ingathering of the grapes there is more work to be done than hands to do it. M. Bloch has had to hire Arabs to assist in the picking, and soldiers to guard against the depredations of jackals and other Arabs. There are some 300 colonists in all, of whom about a quarter are able-bodied men, mostly Romanians, and they seem able to fight and by no means loath to do so on occasion and to protect their own. The houses are neat and substantially built of stone, most have 2 stories, and the principal street, which contains nearly all of the 30 or 40 houses that constitute the village, is wide, straight, and planted with trees, so that it makes quite a little boulevard. Every house has a little garden ground in front, and a yard and outhouse and often a stable behind. The finest building in the place is the official residence of M. Block. This boasts of 2 bedrooms and as many sitting rooms, of which one is the general office of the colony. There are no cows in the colony, water is too expensive, and so the breakfast, which the director was good enough to give me, largely consisted of condensed milk and preserved butter, to which I preferred the honey, as, indeed, the wasps did also. Behind this government house was quite an old-fashioned English flower garden, which it did one's heart good to see, wallflowers in autumn and pansies and irises, and lilies dropping sweet-smelling myrrh. The fleur-de-lis was, of course, a charge of the royal arms of Judah, long before the House of France arrogated to itself the lovely emblem. Near the garden is the site of an unfinished synagogue, which remains as a monument of Turkish bigotry. Before a building can be erected for public worship, the sanction of the Pasha must be obtained. Riouf will not give this, and neither for love nor money is he to be shaken from his determination. The synagogue therefore remains roofless, and but for the foresight of the late director, M. Osavesky, who had a large room planned in the basement, ostensibly for the purpose of a school, the colonists would have no place where they could meet for prayer. The school itself is in an adjoining house, on the first floor. Here a busy class of chubby little boys were learning the mysteries of the circulation of the blood. M. Block is a great purist and insists that all the proletariat of the colony shall speak the most classical Hebrew, so they are taught in that language and answer questions readily and pertinently in the sacred tongue. Much attention is being devoted to the planting of trees. There are about 3,000 olive trees and a like number of almond trees in the colony. Besides these, M. Block pointed out to me some eucalyptus and castor oil trees, both of which grow fast, are shady, and will in time attract clouds and supply the defects of irrigation. The castor oil tree is particularly interesting, as it is probably the original of Jonah's gourd, the phrase by the by favored for the titles of their books by rabbinical authors named after the rebellious prophet, and not a little appropriate. Other colonies. It may be worth while to give a list of the other Palestine colonies, mostly near Jaffa, although conditions of time and space prevented my paying them a visit. They are: the Gate of Hope, 13,500,000 square meters, 411 inhabitants. Juditha, 144,000 square meters, 75 inhabitants. Reuben's Heritage, formerly Wadi Hinnom, 1,500,000 square meters, 38 inhabitants. Bethuia's Memorial, formerly Ekron, 3,500,000 square meters, 226 inhabitants. Gadara, 2,500,000 square meters, 40 inhabitants. Jacob's Memorial, formerly Samarine, near Haifa, 19 million square meters, 644 inhabitants. This was visited by Sir Grant Duff in his recent visit to Palestine, and he refers to it in his article on A Winter in Syria, which appeared in the Contemporary Review for January, 1880. The Cornerstone, near Safed, 3 million square meters, 223 inhabitants. Excelsior, 2 million square meters, 39 inhabitants. Most of these colonies I visited on my subsequent journeys to the Holy Land. The Agricultural School. After we had stayed about 4 hours at Rishon, M. Block was good enough to drive me over to the Agricultural School of the Alliance Israelite about 8 miles away. M. Block drove a light phaeton with 2 horses, which, though not much to look at, managed to carry us, quickly and smoothly, to our destination. After passing through a fine avenue of trees, which might have graced a park, we came to the main building. Although it was nearly noon, we found M. Hirsch, the director, and his wife, in the garden, sitting in the shade. All around were aromatic orange and citron trees. The ethrogym, of course, had all been picked, but the oranges were not yet ripe. However, it would never do to have left the Holy Land without tasting an orange, and so I persuaded M. Hirsch to give me one. It was rather sour, of course, but refreshing, and, besides, I had my way. The orange crop at this garden is quite important. M. Hirsch had disposed of that seasons for no less a sum than 100 Napoleon. There were 40 pupils at the school, all of whom happened to be in one schoolroom, learning geography. They hailed from about a dozen places on the eastern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, and in age they ranged from 12 to 18 years. Despite their ungainly French blue blouses, they looked, albeit somewhat stupid, the picture of health, and sunburnt even beyond expectation. The school possesses some fine machinery, an artesian well, sesame fields, and quite a model farm. The pupils are specially taught fruit and vegetable gardening, and are treated on a kind of apprentice system, by which, after 3 or 4 years' training, they leave the school, with a bonus, or salary, of £40 in their pockets. Of course, the circumstances of the case prevent the whole undertaking from being carried out so as to be anything like self-supporting. But there is no doubt that much good is being done, and that its proud title, XWWMPN, the Hope of Israel, is not undeserved. Since I left, the Alliance has determined to increase the number of the pupils to 60, and to draft to it some of the pupils from its school in Tunis. Apparently, a first batch, consisting of 7 young Tunisians, arrived at the school on the November 19, 1888. After completing their agricultural education at Jaffa, they are to return home to find work with Iokal farmers, till they have saved enough money to become themselves owners of a little farm. How the pupils can best spend the interval between leaving Mikveh Israel and setting up as peasant proprietors themselves, is no easy problem. It may be desirable to use the Montefiore garden at Jaffa, if available, for the purpose of farming it out to the young men, who would thus be almost independent and yet not without supervision. The Montefiore garden. From the agricultural school we drove across country on an execrable track to the Montefiore garden about 5 miles off, 2 miles or less from Jaffa, and immediately opposite the prosperous but anti-Semitic colony of Sarona, founded in 1868 by some Germans from Württemberg. We found that Samson, the caretaker, or farmer, of the garden, he pays no rent, had gone to Jaffa to make his purchases for Sabbath, and had taken the key with him. I represented that, as I held a power of attorney from Mr. Sebag Montefiore, I was justified in breaking open the rude lock, but Sam Hutton's son threatened to go across the road and call a policeman if we did. After considerable battering at the gate, we found that we could not move it, and so thought it best to give up the attempt. However, we looked over the garden from various points of vantage, on tiptoe over the gate, from the window of a building where a massive water wheel has been built over the well, and through gaps in the cactus hedge. The prickly pears were nice to eat, their parasites, the cochineal insects, most curious to watch, but I was unwise enough to make a still closer acquaintance with the hedge. Thinking I could squeeze through one gap which seemed wider than the rest, I put on a pair of gloves and tried to get in. The prickles were too many for me, and I retired in discomfort and discomfiture. For weeks afterwards I could not put on those gloves, and they were a new pair, too, without getting stung. Nevertheless, we saw enough of the garden to satisfy ourselves of its wonderful fertility. Notwithstanding the comparative neglect of its gardeners, the Samtons, who, poor fellows, were down with the fever, the place seemed a very paradise in its luxuriant vegetation, and bananas, dates, oranges, citrons, and plums made the air sweet with their fragrance. We got to Jaffa about 2, met Dr. Diarbila and Mr. Osavesky at Hirsch Cohen's restaurant there, and made an excellent dinner. The Jewish merchants and restaurateurs seemed to be prospering. H.B.M. Vice-Consul, the courteous Mr. Amazalek, is a Jew, and yet, strangely enough, although there are over 2,000 Jews, about an equal number of Ashkenazim and Sephardim, in Jaffa, and a much larger number in the neighborhood, in the colonies, and elsewhere, there is no large synagogue, and only an apology for a Talmud Torah school. The Sephardim have neither rabbi nor teacher, and although there are numerous minyanim, communal affairs seem entirely disorganized. Mr. Kamenetz took me to see the Hotel Palestine, which he had just acquired, and I very much admired its situation and airiness. It is on the Jerusalem Road, and can be confidently recommended to all visitors who wish to break their journey at Jaffa. Mr. Kamenetz's hotel is the only one east of Paris where I have seen soap supplied gratis, and for cleanliness and comfort at Jerusalem his Hotel Jerusalem, and at Jaffa doubtless the Hotel Palestine also, are unsurpassed. His tact in appeasing unwelcome visitors and keeping his guests from worry and annoyance is beyond all praise, and altogether he thoroughly deserves the patronage he receives. About an hour before Sabbath I embarked for Damascus on board the Khedive, Egyptian, steamship, Romania, and regretfully closed one of the most interesting chapters in my life. Palestine Revisited in 1895. The old. A score or so of old men with white beards seated at a long table covered by open volumes of the Talmud. The sacred scroll of the law is enshrined at their left, and behind them we see ponderous old tomes, tight-fitted into the alcove of a vault-like chamber, with quaint curves and angles. Is not this some souvenir from the brush of an old master? No, old-world picture as it is, and appropriately framed, it is from a photograph of an actuality of today. I saw it not so many years ago in Jerusalem, and anyone is welcome to see it tomorrow, or next year, or haply 100 years hence. The very faults in execution are silent witnesses to its truth. The awkward crookedness of the bench, the angularity of the hanging lamps, the uncouth commingling of caps and underscore beards, are necessary results of a camera focused at a disadvantage. The cheap and ugly clock in the corner could not have been introduced into any sketch of the imagination. Its inartistic character is a guarantee of its genuineness. Anyhow, the picture is a real one, and a keen eye will be able to decipher the Hebrew tablet in the background, which identifies the scene. Moreover, the photograph, such as it is at least a triumphant testimonial to the brilliancy of the light in the deepest recesses of a Palestinian city interior. For those whose European eyes cannot decipher the Hebrew, it may be at once stated that this is the likeness of a group of inmates in the Duptawi, or Old People's Rest, at Jerusalem. They are assembled in the principal room of the institution, assembled for prayer, but, in accordance with our good old Jewish custom, they are learning before they pray. The saintly-looking veteran in the center is Rabbi Kaddish Halevi from Wokowisk. Though a comparatively young man of 70, he is, in more respects than one, the head of the yeshiva, or institution. He has 65 male colleagues and 47 female. Many of them are over 80 years of age. One good old dame, Madame Brena Spira, from Zaslav, is over 97 years old. Daniel Ibn Joseph Tull, of Smyrna, is 92, and Salem Rosanowski, of Kishinev, 90. The tall, emaciated-looking man standing in front of the curtain of the ark is a smith, Abraham Scala. The previous occupations of the men are all detailed in the annual report of the institution. 3 of the men were colonists, 1 a doctor, several teachers, shoshadim, builders, tailors, peddlers, a brass worker, an Myri weaver of fringes, and so on. One pleasing but very Russian feature about the charity is that connected with it we find not a soup kitchen, but a tea kitchen. For 2 hours after nightfall every applicant is entitled to a glass of hot tea gratis, and there are 400 glasses or so dispensed every night, a happy form of benevolence which dimly recalls the generous food doles of the medieval monastery and convent. What strikes one most about the inmates is the refinement and intellectuality of their features. It is a workhouse, where aged failures in the struggle for existence are entertained, free of expense. Here they are permitted to pass away in peace. Not here will we meet with degraded types of the European inebriate or jailbird. Nor is there anything characteristically Jewish about the appearance of our friends. In fact, there is no place like Jerusalem, where all nations meet, for convincing one of the fact that there's no characteristic type for the Jewish countenance. The old man at the corner of the table, fourth to the right of our Kaddish, could sit as a model for Tycho Brahe. The man behind him looks like a Moor of Venice, and some of them are just moujiks and nothing more. But they are all representative of one very fascinating aspect of Judaism, which it is the fashion to doubt or decry. It is not only in India that the yogi, or contemplative sage, is to be met with, who, having fulfilled his whole duty as a man, retires from active life to meditate on the here and the hereafter. We have our Jewish yogis even outside the dazzling effulgence which emanates from the Zohar. Such an one was our dear friend Mr. Zimmer, and of such is the bulk of the Mashab Zakinim. They work not, neither do they spin, but the world is better for their being in it, even if not of it. It is refreshing to think that not everybody is in a hurry, not everybody busy money getting or money spending, and that a few there are who, like the tertiary creatures still to be found in the Jordan as living fossils, are survivals of bygone and more tranquil ages. The present position of the building is just where one would expect to find it. It is in the oldest part of the city, near the Maidan, and about 2 minutes' walk from the chief Ashkenazi synagogue, which is built on the Yon Onanan, the ruin of our Judah the Pious. It occupies 2 sides of its narrow lane. In Jerusalem proper there are no streets. On the one side is the men's house, the property of the institution and registered as waqf, or charity property. The women occupy the quarters opposite, but their house is merely hired. Still it has the advantage of possessing a fine view of the temple area from the roof. Fine, however, as is the position from the sentimental point of view, the site is necessarily not salubrious, and although our old people seem to thrive, they would have more fresh air outside the city. There we have the real, New Jerusalem, and there the Jew's heart must warm within him when he sees the neat clusters of trim little stone houses, which have grown up as if by magic in the last decade. There are many such clusters now from the quaint rock dwellings of the troglodyte men of Yemen, which overhang the valley of Hinnom, to the neat cottages of the Sir Moses Montefiore Testimonial Committee's Building Society. Street nomenclature is in its infancy in the East and therefore picturesque. The right hand of Moses, and Nathan's village, now replace the squalid huts of the squatters who had to be turned out of the Montefiore garden 7 years ago. They constitute a very creditable approach to the city as one leaves the railway station, and I was told that the sight of their Sabbath lamps gleaming out of 100 windows on a Friday night was the prettiest thing to be seen from the Lechmere Hospital opposite. 100 gates, and Montefiore Memorial, the gate of the cornerstone, Moses Gate, the house of Israel, Rechoboth, the inheritance of 7, stone of Israel, and Tabernacle of Peace, are some other names that bring us by easy stages to the country end of the Jaffa Road. Here, close by the watchtower, which marks the uttermost end of outer Jerusalem, for a Turkish octroi allows no dwellings on the wrong side of the guard, the Mosheb Zakinim has purchased a plot of 11,000 square meters, and commenced a new building after the model of the Alterversorgungst in Berlin. It was induced to do this by the munificent promise of 35,000 rubles from a Russian millionaire. But the millionaire was litigious, and after he had paid 5,000 rubles, behold, the High Court of Justice at St. Petersburg placed a distringas on the whole of his property, and he cannot continue payment. And so the building is stopped for the present. Perhaps the best plea for the Mosheb Zakinim is a quotation in the Psissima Verba of its manager's petition to pious ladies and gentlemen, which, though its English may be halting, is in sentiment irreproachable. It is beyond our power, they write, to sustain all its wants. God knows we have done the utmost it offers, but we must now appeal to the generous and pious for aid. Have compassion, pious folk, and take part in the meritorious subject. Please obtain for yourselves memberships of this society by paying the members' fee, and the reward for your piety and generosity will be exceedingly large in this world and in the world to come. Please grant your support to this society, and the Almighty will grant fulfillment of all your desire and will permit you to live and rejoice in the restoration of Zion and Jerusalem. Who of you, brethren, does not feel for the old and feeble, poor and helpless, who have none to look after them, no one to care for them, who would eagerly wish to spend their last days on earth in prayers and study of the Holy Torah in the holy city of Jerusalem, were there but a corner to receive the new? A very different picture, but in its way quite as satisfactory, would be presented by a portrait group of teachers and scholars of the Lionel de Rothschild School at Jerusalem. The contrast is an invigorating one, for youth is always more cheering than age. Here we would find no poky interior, but a substantial modern building with European windows and shutters, and neat wooden paling and the olive tree to supply local color. Nothing but the fez, which marks the official element throughout the Sultan's dominions, would distinguish the group from a European one of similar character. The very bars across the windows would only be witnesses to the fact that boys will be boys even in Palestine, and just as the ground floor windows that give on college back in England protect the student from themselves, so is the intern of our school protected from unlicensed evasion. The physiognomies of the students vary more even than those of their elders in the Mosheb Zakinim. And necessarily so. For in the technical school we find a heterogeneous assembly of different nations, and happily of different creeds. Jews can well be proud of the fact that in the hotbed of religious fanaticism, they were the first to throw open their doors to all religions, and Mohammedan and Christian alike testify to the excellence of the work of our Jewish schools. The young men now learn the trades of blacksmith and joiner, locksmith and mechanic, coppersmith and brass founder, sculptor and carriage builder. It is a veritable university of technical education. It draws its pupils from Palestine and Turkey, and Russia and Romania and even Greece, and it sends them back, when they have passed through their apprenticeship, to Egypt, to the Palestine colonies, such as Rishon and Petach Tikva and Samarin, to Belgrade, to Cyprus, to Rhodes, and even to Marseilles, and wherever they go they earn a decent living by the work of their hands. In Jerusalem itself the work they do is indispensable. The upper stories of the hospital and hotel there are fitted with a water supply entirely made by the pupils. They have constructed steam engines and pumps and all the mystic paraphernalia of modern sanitation. Certainly some parts of a 10-horsepower engine which was shown to me were made of brass instead of iron, but that was because we have not yet an iron foundry there. The technical school cannot at once make handicraftsmen of all our Oriental co-religionists, but its pupils are already spreading afield throughout the East and disseminating love of work and respect for the school among distant Jewish communities. I have myself come across young men trained there who are now earning decent livelihoods as artisans, not only in Palestine, but in Cyprus, and even in Egypt. For the rest, thanks largely to English philanthropy, the number of workshops is constantly increasing, and their efficiency is growing more and more marked. Nowhere is the prejudice that Jews will not work with their hands so rapidly becoming antiquated as at Jerusalem. Convents and mosques, hospitals and churches, villas and hotels, all are dependent on the technical school for the provision of fitments to supply them with the uppunnage of civilization. The folding doors of the convent of St. Joseph move so smoothly and look so smart that they would do credit to the most efficient cabinet makers of London or Paris. There are carved bookcases at the school made on the premises and by the scholars which would rouse a bibliomaniac to envy. But a single instance will perhaps evidence more vividly than any mere words the moral benefit derived from the existence of such an institution in Palestine. When I reached Jerusalem, I was informed that its scholars were actually manufacturing iron gates for the tombs of the patriarchs at Hebron, and that the gates had been ordered by the sheikh and his ecclesiastical board, who were pressing for delivery. Now, as has been said before, if there is one thing more sacred than another, or more jealously guarded by Tne Turk, it is this mosque which is erected over the cave of Machpelah. Hardly half a dozen Europeans have been allowed to visit it. The last occasion, but one, was when the Dukes of Clarence and York went there with Major Condor. They obtained the requisite special firman from the Sultan, and a regiment of soldiers to protect them, and yet there was a riot in the narrow white lanes of Hebron when they entered the mosque. Well, I was allowed, with 2 Moslem pupils, to penetrate there disguised as a mechanical advisor to our school. I wore a tarbush and carried a measure in my hand, and some bottles of gilding wherewith to make beautiful the gates we had brought with us and were about to set up. I dared not talk for fear of betraying myself as a very ordinary tourist, but before we were accorded admittance, a preliminary palaver with the sheikh of the mosque was necessary, and, with the greatest solemnity in the world and with oriental gesture, I had to vehemently negative the idea that the gilding would come off in the rain. I visited also the Evelina de Rothschild School for Girls, and the admirable villa which the association had just acquired from the Latin Patriarch for its new premises. Ndli. Fortuny Behar, its energetic directress, was determined to conduct her school on English lines. Mahanaim, as the villa is called, was built 5 or 6 years ago by the bankers Frutiger, and inhabited by them till they left Jerusalem. Its windows command an ideal view of the Mosque of Omar, and the temple area, and the Mount of Olives. Its garden is full of fine trees, and its wells more than amply supplied with water. Both timber and water are valuable commodities at Jerusalem, and will somewhat compensate for the increased cost of maintenance of the school. Little, if any, alteration is needed in adapting the interior for school purposes, and my friend, Mr. Richardson, one of the surveyors to the Board of Trade, went over the premises, and was satisfied as to their being in a good state of repair. There were difficulties as to title, but these have, I understand, been now circumvented, if not overcome. What difficulties there had been were evidently due to a very real jealousy on the part of the Turkish officials, with regard to the ever-increasing influence and number of Jews in Palestine. The Alliance schools at Jaffa, for boys and girls, also call for praise. Jaffa has become almost a Hebrew port. The shop fronts are crowned by Hebrew names and signposts. The market is a Jewish forum, and the very infants speak Bible Hebrew. There are few things more touching to the Jew returning to the land of his forefathers than to find his little co-religionists doing their lessons in Hebrew, even prattling in it, as a very living language, the language of play. This is end of part 5. To listen to the next part, please click on the end screen playlist or video part 6. If you like the story, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It costs nothing, it's all free. Thank you.